I'm on. Perfect. Thank you so much. Welcome to Clean Energy Connections tonight. And welcome to Circular City Week New York, the first ever Circular City Week. Circular City Week is a collaborative festival of events all over New York City this week, all in support of circular economy. The aim of this week essentially being to showcase the transformative power that circular economy can have to urban industries. There are some staggering numbers out there about what circular economy could do to the global economy. A few years back, $1 trillion was mentioned as the economic potential for circular economy just in 2025. We are here today to talk a little bit more about how this locally might look in a New York context, though. And for those of you who might be a little bit new to the circular economy, the circular economy is essentially about designing out the concept of waste. But after tonight, you will be much wiser on what that actually means and how that actually works. I am Tone Søndergaard, and I work for the Danish Cleantech Hub. And then you might ask yourself, why is a Dane standing here doing a Circular City Week in New York? The Danish Cleantech Hub is dedicated to creating and facilitating transatlantic conversations and knowledge sharing. And essentially, the circular economy has been a topic that we've been talking a lot about in Europe. So we started talking about it in the US and in New York specifically, and realized that no one really was using the term circular economy that much. But we were seeing a lot of different initiatives taking place all over the city, and sort of decided that we wanted to make a Circular City Week to give all these organizations, and those you are going to see tonight included, sort of a backdrop to tell their story and start the conversations with each other and with you guys. I'm happy to let you know that Circular City Week now consists of 30 events. You have the options to hear more than 70 speakers throughout the city. More than 50 organizations are involved, and you are part of the 2,000 people who are going to take part in events this week alone. I also just want to give a very brief shout out to the organizations who've made it possible for us to do a Circular City Week. Those are Arup, it's the Center for the Circular Economy by Closed Loop Partners, it's Central Region Denmark, Cooper Recycling, ING Financial Services, and Rockwool. But without further ado, I want to give the stage to your host tonight. That is Pat Sapinsley from the Urban Future Lab. Urban Future Lab also being the home of the Danish Cleantech Hub, so it's a wonderful honor to welcome you, and thank you so much for supporting Circular City Week by doing this amazing event. Thank you.
So I want to thank Tona and the whole Danish Cleantech Hub. They are a very important part of our Urban Future Lab, which I'll tell you about in a minute. First, I have to take care of some silly little housekeeping. Most importantly, tip the bartender. Next, importantly, don't let your beer bottles fall on the floor. Don't let your cell phones ring, because this is all being recorded, and we're going to hear all that, and you're going to be terribly embarrassed if it's your fault. What else do you need to know? Our beer tonight is provided by Toast Ale, which is a terrific example of the circular economy. Toast Ale takes how shall I characterize this bread? Very fresh, but maybe not purchased that day. And that bread is then taken to their facility where they turn it into beer by adding hops and a few other things. So circular economy is something that can make money for people. Toast Ale certainly makes money on their beer, except when they give it away like tonight, which is wonderful of them. And the other thing they do is their profits do go to a charity that is a sustainable charity. So can I hear a shout out for Toast Ale? They are great. Okay, let's see. Cell phones I covered. Bottles, this is a very important piece of paper. Bottles, note cards. The way we're going to do questions tonight is that you got note cards on your way in. If you need additional ones, raise your hand and one of our people will come by. Towards the end of the discussion, pass your note cards out to the end of the aisle where one of our people will pick them up and bring them to the moderator. Okay, so that's how we're going to do questions tonight. Now let me tell you who I am and what I do, what we do. I run the Urban Future Lab, which is part of NYU Tendon School of Engineering. We are a mission-driven institute that has 5 programs. The largest program is the Acre Incubator, where we help companies to scale up who are young companies working in the circular economy or resiliency or smart city or smart grid. These are all things that contribute to climate change, to fixing climate change. And we're trying to help companies that have market-ready solutions to climate change. It's extremely important to understand that the cost of doing nothing about climate change is far more than the cost of doing something about climate change. So I feel it's my duty tonight to implore each of you to abandon your existing careers and join us in the green economy. There are many ways to do that. Yeah, there are many ways to do that. We run a program. There are 5 programs I mentioned at the Urban Future Lab. One is the incubator, where we help those companies with market-ready solutions. Another is called Clean Start, which is an educational program that we run with NYU, of course. It meets evenings and weekends and helps people who are in other segments of the economy to retrain so that they can come back and help us to solve this horrible problem. So it started, I think, in January. Applications will be accepted next year in November. Keep it on your radar screen. Look at our website, ufl.nyc, if you're interested in joining next year. The green economy is growing really fast. Our graduates get jobs right away, and they take courses at night and on weekends that tell them about energy efficiency or project finance or how the grid works. It's a really fascinating course. Quickly, the other programs are Power Bridge New York, that helps academic startups working in the green economy to scale up. H2 Refuel, which is a new program we're doing. If any of you are working in hydrogen, we want to hear from you. Go to our website, ufl.nyc, and look at the H2 Refuel program. We're helping Toyota and Shell to find companies in the hydrogen economy. And the last one, is a new utility piloting program that we're doing that hasn't quite been announced yet, but it is for young companies that want to pilot their technologies on the New York grid in EV or storage. So please look at ufl.nyc to find out more about that. Sign up for our newsletter at that website, you'll know more. April 22nd, we are doing the biggest, most important event that's happening in New York for Earth Day. It will highlight the winners of our worldwide competition. Our competition garnered 94 entries from 20 countries to compete for $50,000 non-dilutive prizes funded by New York Community Trust and Con Ed. We encourage you to come to that event and see these companies pitch. There'll be some very exciting keynote speeches prior to that, including Alicia Barton, the CEO of NYSERDA, who's doing great stuff. And my call to arms to you is to not sit idly by. We do not have the time to waste anymore. Any of you who are working in anything else are wasting your time. Come join us in the green economy, I implore you. Help yourselves by looking at ufl.nyc and figure out how you can join us, okay? Now, coming out, come on, panelists. I'm hoping they're listening. They're sitting in the green room eating a delicious dinner. There we go. Here's Danielle Joseph, who will be moderating, and she will introduce the other panelists. Danielle is currently an investor at Closed Loop Fund. Prior to that, she was an investor at New World Capital. She will tell you more about herself and more about the other panelists. Thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Can you all hear me? Yes. How about now? Now? So great. Thank you all so much for coming. We're really excited to be here. Thank you to Tona and the Danish Clean Tech Hub and to Pat and the Urban Future Lab for having us all. As Pat mentioned, I'm Danielle Joseph, working with Closed Loop Partners as a variety of different investment vehicles. We focus on investing in the circular economy, which, as you've heard a little bit about already, is this concept of reducing waste in supply chains, and wherever there is waste, taking it and turning it into something of greater value. And a lot of you here, I think, are from the energy sector, and so you know that it's better to use renewable fuels, things that are already widely available, to create energy for our electricity use. And we see the same thing in a lot of materials that we deal with. So whether it's food that you've already harvested, or plastic that you've already made, or textiles that you've already manufactured, there's no need to throw that into a landfill. Instead of just letting it sit there, We think it's much better to reuse that material and keep it in circulation in the economy. We think that that's really great for a number of reasons. One is it's more capital efficient. Two is it can decrease the volatility in the markets in the same way that you can think of long-term power purchase agreements in solar or wind that reduce the volatility of your energy prices. You can envision the same thing in the plastics economy. Instead of buying pellets that are pegged to the price of oil and fluctuate in volatility along with that, you can imagine that smoothing that curve out. And so that's part of what we're trying to do, both at small scales through our investing work and at a large scale, hopefully with all the panelists working together today. So I'll go through and introduce everyone. We've got Michael, who is the CEO at the Trust for Governors Island. Taniya, who is from Renewable, sorry.
It's okay.
And Ka, who's the Director of Infrastructure at the Mayor's Office of Sustainability and Resiliency. And so we're here today to really talk about circularity across all of these different government and private sector solutions and really get to the heart of what are the problems that we're facing today and how can we work together to solve them. So with that, would love to start with Ka, actually. What does a circular economy mean for cities? And how is your office approaching the challenges specific to New York City?
Sorry, let me get myself adjusted here. So I think the circular economy presents a great opportunity for cities. One of the driving factors is that it ultimately reduces our ecological footprint. It helps decouple economic growth and consumer engagement from consumption, which I think is something that we're starting to see, especially in the energy space and carbon emissions, where we're starting to decouple, for example, our economic growth from the growth in carbon emissions. I also think it's really a unique opportunity to engage our citizens and to try to change and incentivize kind of essentially behavior change, because I do think that in order for a circular economy to be scaled up in the way that we envision, that it does require significant engagement among the citizenry and essentially a seismic shift in how we view our consumption and what that means. I also think it's a unique opportunity to drive innovation locally, to create new markets for products that we may not have envisioned before. And I think finally, I think you touched upon this, I think there's a significant number of co-benefits when it comes to thinking about a circular economy. In addition to kind of reducing our emissions, improving air quality, it also, I think, has a resiliency benefit. For example, rather than relying on supply chains that stretch across the globe, including from volatile parts of the world as well as different parts of the US, you have the opportunity to create resources locally and to use those resources locally. So for example, I think a lot about how we can maintain a resilient and sustainable energy supply for the city. And one of the unique opportunities the circular economy presents is kind of converting waste to energy. So rather than relying on natural gas that's being fracked in Pennsylvania or potentially from other parts of the world, you have the opportunity to create that locally and use that locally.
And Ka, maybe before we move on, you could explain a little bit about your role.
Sure. So I work at the Mayor's Office of Resiliency as well as the Office of Sustainability and primarily deal with issues related to how can we make our energy supply, so that's electricity, natural gas, and fuels, more sustainable, less carbon intensive, but also reliable and affordable so that we can all transition to the low carbon economy that we're striving for.
Great. And Taniya, could you explain a little bit about your business and then also explain a little bit about what role you see startups playing in this circular economy?
Sure. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with a sore throat. My name is Taniya P Nam. I'm the founder and CEO of Renewable. And what we do is we take unrecoverable produce waste from food distributors and food processors. So that residual that can't be directed to food banks or for animal feed, we take that and we turn into plant-based technologies for agriculture. The reason why we started doing what we were doing is because we realized that New York City is a great example of what is called urban metabolism. All the our consumption and all the resources that we consume are byproducts that ultimately we'd like to bring back and turn into a commodity or resource that can be constantly recirculated. And so what that means for us is we saw a need not only for this growing urban waste stream that's only going to continue to increase in volume, to make use of that and capture the nutrients from this waste stream, but to allow for more farms to grow organically, sustainably, and even more encouraging regenerative agriculture as well, focusing on hydroponic or indoor farming, because growing in those systems using anything that's naturally derived or biological in nature is significantly challenging, which is why a lot of them use chemically derived mineral salts. Just to give you some perspective, the fertilizer supply chain or the industry contributes 3% of the global carbon emissions. So we always thought about how, we can completely eradicate that and focus on localized waste streams to serve as that input for our agriculture. Having a lot of discussions around just looking at both industrial and commercial food waste generators, there are significant needs to focus on specific homogenized waste streams. So, for example, we were talking to a food processor upstate, and they have a unique challenge that is not different to any other waste treatment plant in any other city, where how can they use oils, whether it's sunflower seed oil, castor oil, from their processing, and that is significantly challenging to turn it into another valuable or value-added byproduct. That's a interesting idea or opportunity for a startup to reclaim and provide a service for those types of food processors. I also see, kind of going forward, and I'll end it this way soon, but wastewater treatment plants are increasingly burdened by what we see being liquefied from food waste down floor drains. If they don't have a very cheap and energy efficient way to process this increasing a load that these treatment plants are having to process, it's only going to increase or exacerbate these challenges. So I see biologicals serving as a need for that, and startups definitely have a lot of opportunity to innovate in that space as well.
That's great. Yeah, and just to connect with what Ka and Taniya were just saying, a lot of the work that Closed Loop Partners does is across both municipalities and improving the collection of recyclable and organic materials, and then improving the processing of that material into higher waste things or higher value things. And as we were doing that work with cities across the country, we realized that there was this lack of innovation, that in order to actually achieve the goals that we had set forward, there was going to need to be new innovations and new technologies to help us reach those goals. And so that's why we created Closed Loop Ventures, which is an early stage investment vehicle to invest in early stage companies like what Taniya is talking about. That's the group that I manage within Closed Loop Ventures, within Closed Loop Partners. Michael, I was wondering if you could introduce yourself a little bit as well, and then also talk about circular economy and implementing zero waste initiatives within Governor's Island and the challenges that you face.
Sure. Well, first of all, I always like to start by asking who has not been to Governor's Island. You can raise your hand. Shame on you. We open May 1st, so you're welcome to come out. It's an amazing place to be. Governor's Island is a 172-acre island in New York Harbor. It probably, just to stay on theme with the topic at hand, it is probably one of the best metaphors for adaptive reuse and circular economy. It was this island that was a U.S. Army base for much of its life, and then it was turned into a public park. Probably a lot easier than building a brand new island in New York Harbor that we actually reused an old island. And the history of the island is pretty amazing, not so much for military history, because we did not have a lot of wars here in New York since the Revolution. But it is a place that actually expanded thanks to people thinking about reusing resources efficiently. Probably more than half of the island, 100 acres, was added between 1902 and 1912 with spoils from the IRT subway, which the planning dorks like myself might already know. But we actually took dirt and rocks that were part of Manhattan and made it part of Governor's Island in terms of thinking about being more efficient in terms of the use of our resources. But today, Governor's Island is a seasonal destination for New Yorkers. About 75% of the people who come to Governor's Island are from the 5 boroughs, which I'm very happy about. And it is a place that New Yorkers get to experience nature in a very unique setting. We're car-free, which is wonderful. It's one of the few places you hear birds more than you hear buses. And it is one of these amazing resources for New Yorkers where they get to reconnect with nature in a pretty dynamic setting. loads of historic architecture, which hopefully some of you have been able to explore, and lots of development potential, which we could talk about a little later as well. I mean, one of the unique things about Governor's Island, though, is that we have really leaned into environmental stewardship in a deep way, not just being car-free and being a place where people can commune with nature in a direct way, but since we are quite a closed loop ourselves. I mean, we are a real island. There's not a bridge. There's not a tram. You have to get there by ferry. So we are a completely non-porous environment. And the trust, as the entity that owns and controls the island, has a unique position, certainly vis-a-vis the city. I mean, we are city-owned and controlled, but we are one entity which has essentially 100% responsibility for design, planning, operations, and maintenance. So we literally know everything that comes on the island. We know everything that comes off the island. So you talk about the metabolism. We are a very tiny island, only 172 acres, but there's one entity that controls it. So we actually do have a lot of data in terms of our consumption of not just energy, but also resources. We are a unique platform for thinking about the circular economy, particularly with regard to waste. We have a great on-island partner in Earth Matter, I hope, and some of them may be here today. Earth Matter processes 125,000 pounds of compost and food waste every month, which is a lot. If you, like me, bring your compost to your local farmer's market, because I don't have it in my neighborhood, if you bring it to your farmer's market, it probably ends up on Governor's Island and becomes compost that actually keeps our park green. So on-island partnerships, enormously important in terms of thinking about food waste. We're a net importer of food waste, which is extraordinary, and I'm okay with that, although I'd like to generate a lot more food waste on island at some point so that we could actually find that balanced area. And we're also, because we're a singular form of governance, again, somewhat like the city, but in a more kind of tightly controlled way, we could do things very progressively. So, for example, last year we banned styrofoam before the city. We banned single-use plastic bags before the city. We forced
there.
Yeah, we're getting there. But we're a microcosm, which is actually a good test case, and I like to think of us as a living laboratory for how we could actually test out issues which may be more challenging because of politics and people. But we were able to, by even just a small switch, so we forced, this was not popular with my staff, some of whom are here today, that we forced every vendor to use compostable serviceware. Hard to do in New York, but maybe we'll get there. And that meant that 12% more organics went into our food waste stream. So that was, showing that you can actually affect change in a pretty direct way through sometimes carrots, sometimes sticks. But I think we are a unique environment because we can actually effectuate change in a small environment that can hopefully be scaled up for cities around the world.
Right. Yeah, no, and it's fascinating to hear you talk about Governor's Island as a microcosm, because New York City is largely an island, save the Bronx, right? Mm-hmm. Where we are importing a lot of materials every day, and as just a primer, and I'm sure Kai, you can talk more to this, everything that gets shipped to the city and that we then throw in our trash or throw in our recycling, then gets shipped out of the city to either, not just to Jersey, but sometimes as far as Alabama to be disposed of, because there's not space in Manhattan or Brooklyn or Staten Island or, even the Bronx, right? Everything is really concentrated. And so it presents this real challenge around materials, right? These are physical, big objects. And so how do you, Ka, what do you think really needs to be done in the city of New York to achieve zero waste? What are these things that we can really work on?
Yeah, so to those who are not familiar, the city does have a zero waste to landfills goal by 2030, which is, I would say, faster and closer than some of our carbon goals, which are still set at 2050, although we have an interim 2030 goal. So, we're doing a number of things. Currently DSNY, and one thing also to keep in mind is that our sanitation agency handles residential waste. So commercial waste, which accounts for around 50% of the waste generated in the city, is actually managed and carted by commercial haulers. So I'll get back to what we're doing in that space in a second. But for our own agency, we're really focused on, so we have currently we have the largest organics collection program in the country, where we serve 3.5 million residents. I know there was some recent discussion about kind of, rather than expanding right away, kind of looking at what's going on within the neighborhoods where the program is currently operating and doing some expanded outreach and education. One of the issues we've had with organics collection, I think to your kind of some of the anecdotes that you mentioned, is that there's significant contamination, especially from plastics. And so I think we need to take a relook at what's happening and kind of extrapolate some lessons learned as we kind of double down our efforts in those neighborhoods before we continue to expand. We're really focused on getting rid of plastics. So as you know, Council passed a bill in 2015 banning plastic bags, and that got preempted by the state. We understand from the state that this year they're looking at a plastic bag ban for the state, and that's something that we would be strongly supportive of. As of this year, we banned foam-based products in restaurants and food kitchens, and so that has a 6-month warning period before it'll go into full enforcement second half of this year. And then we're also really targeting e-waste, as well as expanding recycling efforts. So I think one of the most important things that we're seeing is that you need to have, and I think this is echoing to this point, where you need to have kind of homogeneous waste streams in order to maximize their reusability. So whether it's electronics, plastics, as well as organics, the ability to aggregate and have homogeneous waste streams is a key input into then achieving kind of the next step for that waste. So one of the, when we talk about, for example, waste to energy, this is a really interesting challenge for the city because we have obviously a lot of waste and we have significant energy needs. In particular, 65% of our carbon emissions comes from buildings, and of that, 2/3 comes from heating buildings. So we're not talking about getting more renewable electricity. We're trying to find a low carbon alternative for natural gas that's used directly to heat your homes and to create hot water. So that's a different challenge from getting more renewables onto the grid. So there's 2 ways to tackle that. One, you could move from natural gas and oil-based heating and hot water systems to efficient electric ones. And that assumes then that the grid itself is clean. The other alternative is looking at low-carbon fuels that could replace that gas. And one primary source for low-carbon gas, or carbon-free gas, if you consider the life cycle, is essentially renewable biogas. And how that's created is, right now we have a pilot at Newtown Creek where we are getting organic waste to Newtown, pre-processed organic waste that's then added to the Newtown Creek's digesters. Newtown Creek is the city's biggest wastewater treatment plant. We have a capacity to process 250 tons of organic waste a day. Right now we're about half of that, and that tends to fluctuate because we're relying a lot on the schools for a lot of the organic material. And so what comes out of that is already these digesters, in order to process the sludge and the wastewater before it gets cleaned up, it goes through a process where anaerobic bacteria essentially break down the organic matter and, as a byproduct, creates methane, which is CH4, which is otherwise known as natural gas. The biogas that's created within the digesters is about 60 to 65% pure methane. And so the Newtown Creek pilot is, in addition to processing the sludge, adding significant amounts of organic waste and food matter to co-process and turn that into biogas. The second part of that project, which is currently in construction and should start this year, is that rather than using the biogas to power, the wastewater treatment plant's heating processes, we're actually looking at cleaning up the gas to pipeline quality gas, so that's more like 97% pure, and then re-injecting it into National Grid's gas system that would then heat homes. So I think that's a really nice example of, if you can get it right, the circular economy is really powerful. The challenge, of course, is then how do you get clean, reliable, aggregated amounts of organic waste that can be then processed either at a wastewater treatment plant or at a standalone, what we call a merchant anaerobic digestion facility. I think all of this is receiving even more added attention and urgency now because New York City is also a gas supply constrained market, which means that we don't necessarily have enough gas to meet our growing needs. And so an example of that is Con Edison, our electric utility, but also our gas utility, which services Manhattan, the Bronx, and the first Queens Community District 1, actually imposed a gas moratorium on Westchester. So right now, Westchester, which Con Edison also serves in addition to New York City, starting in March, no new construction can get a gas hookup because they're concerned about not enough gas. So as part of that, Con Ed recently went out to the market with a solicitation that they called a non-pipe solicitation. So looking at both demand-side solutions and alternative supply-side solutions to mitigate this potential inability to meet demand. And one of the projects that they're trying to advance as part of that is actually a merchant anaerobic digestion facility. So it's like really interesting that we're starting to see not only this happening at the wastewater treatment plants, but also the private investment community coming in and looking at these opportunities. And then we are also aware of some companies and other organizations that manage and handle a lot of food waste themselves are also evaluating and considering anaerobic digestion at their own facility or at their own site. So it's a really exciting and interesting time, I think, to be in this space. And we're seeing kind of pressure and drivers coming in different directions.
Yeah.
So sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, it was great. You mentioned a lot of things that were really exciting. One is this idea of waste to energy and specifically organics to energy. And I think that that's a really important thing to note. Organics at the end of their life, there's not much else we can do with them other than create energy either in that can be used in the markets as you're talking about with AD, or composting them or using them as fertilizers and turning them into more nutrient dense products and solutions. And so they're not going to become food immediately again, right? Mm-hmm. And so that creating energy or energy-like products out of them is a really interesting concept. The other thing that you mentioned that I just want to touch on is the plastics that are really hard to recycle. So plastic bags, straws, styrofoam. The bags and straws are problematic because bags actually get caught in the recycling equipment over at Sims, which is the recycling facility over in Red Hook. And so it actually stops the equipment, right? Straws are problematic because the conveyor belts that all of the plastics go on are like they have breaks in them that a plastic bottle will go over, but a straw will fall through. And that becomes contamination in your glass stream or in your paper stream. And so that's a problem. Electronics are a problem because every time they go into a truck or get onto some of the recycling equipment, they typically actually cause fires. They get compressed and explode. Right? So it's actually really important that you guys don't throw these things into your recycling bins. But then there are plastics that do actually have markets, right? Your plastic water bottles, your Tide bottles, your polypropylene plastics, your 1, 2, 4. Sims actually tends to recycle all of the plastics that come into their facility because there's so much of it. So there are markets for plastics. There's a problem with hard to recycle plastics, like these thin films, like your toothpaste bottles or toothpaste cans that have multiple layers of different types of plastics. Those are the things that are really hard to recycle. I think with a combination of policy and corporate action, we're starting to see a lot of movement towards getting those out of the stream, which is really, really positive. And I want to go back to Taniya because I know you are dealing with organics and collecting organics within the city limits in a way that's really impressive. And I wonder if you want to talk a bit more about that, how you're doing it, what types of customers you have, and then other folks who who are doing similar things that are contributing to this organic solution.
Sure, thank you. So we, I think that our value proposition is coming in and creating a zero greenhouse gas emission model where we're able to take the food waste coming in within 24 hours and we pelletize it. And our whole novelty is this granulated form of the food waste allows the farms, and I'm going to speak towards hydroponic farms first, though it could be sold to soil-based farms, and that's a later market for us. the novelty is with only 1 pound of this granulated fertilizer, they're able to fully derive all the nutrients they need, let's say for lettuce, for 45 days. So it's really cost effective for the farm. We're hopefully, incentivizing them to grow with the most sustainable best practices, and that is derived from plant-based technologies, which is what we're pushing for, given the pushback from some of the food safety scares from animal manure or animal byproducts that's been in formerly fertilizers. And then the other thing is that we're enabling a lot of these farms to just be able to get more from the food waste than they normally would from any other type of organic fertilizer. So there's just a lot concentrated in this fertilizer that we haven't seen in the market available yet. We do it in a way that complements a lot of these, municipal scale anaerobic digesters. The feedback we've been getting is, okay, well, even though, let's say, existing commercial haulers are taking food waste from food distributors and doing the right thing, bringing it to a composting facility that's 2 hours north of here, but the problem is that it's at a significant cost. So if they could divert it to us and at a much smaller scale, everyone's saving. We're saving on carbon emissions from a reduction of haulers actually on the road and just reducing the cost for the end food processor or food distributor. We never aspire to become a waste management of organic waste. We definitely see Renewable being a regional facility operator that can be replicated across the country. What we don't want to be beholden to is regulatory policies that are driving for organic waste diversion. We've seen the back challenges in Massachusetts, for example, where they had a lot of motivation and the right type of goal to allow for more organic waste recyclers to operate, especially at a larger municipal scale, but the state wasn't invoking or mandating the policies needed to create compliance fines so that businesses that created or generated a substantial amount of food waste wasn't getting any type of financial penalty, right? So then they weren't doing the right thing, and therefore wasn't creating enough food waste volume for these anaerobic digesters to be able to operate. So then it becomes a whole downside risk, not only for investors that want to invest in these type of business models, because the last time I checked, I think food waste is valued at $96 billion opportunity. So if I could say anything, it is, there's going to be a ton of opportunity, whether as a consultant or a startup that has figured out a way to make individual commercial businesses, either commercial level or industrial, to first think about how the waste byproducts, irrespective of the process or operation, can be reused or turned into a value-added product. For instance, the waste oil that I was speaking of, or let's say potato peels that are at such a homogenized volume that that operator can't do anything with. Because if you can provide value for these operators, then one, they aren't beholden to any type of state-based mandates that are driving for these policies to incentivize them to do that. I think that's it.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's amazing, and it taps into what we look for at Closed Loop Ventures, are companies that can survive irregardless of whatever the policy environment is, right? Because there is that danger, that risk of there might be a policy that's super progressive and really great for this company, but if it's not enforced in the right way, that's a risk to the capital that we put into the business, and it's a risk to the business itself, and obviously to the effectiveness of the government programs. At the same time as that's what we look for in our investments, there is still a role for policy to play, and I think there are opportunities for well-crafted policy, and it's very hard and definitely beyond me to craft it. But there is opportunity for that to occur and to incentivize really innovative solutions. And one way around that might be pricing it differently. But I wonder, Michael, if you want to talk to any policies that you've been able to create on the island that really do a great job of incentivizing the right kind of behavior.
Well, I think just flowing on the kind of the regulatory regime. We like the city, we're mission oriented, so we are non-market based. So unlike entrepreneurs, we are really trying to be about doing the right thing and hopefully creating a platform that people can innovate in ultimately when it comes to either circular economy or having a greener view of the world. We, I think, are unique in that we don't, we just write regulation. I mean, and because we are this unique entity, as I said, we could just, wholly write something and people may grumble against it, but they can see that, oh, well, by the way, sure, maybe the compostable straw is a little bit more than the regular straw, but it really won't break their bank. When I think about it, it's like how we actually, disincentivize bad behavior. I mean, that really, when I've said on panels like this before, what immediately comes up, to be a little controversial about it, is that we don't actually price our trash appropriately. I mean, it's like, it's the gorilla in the room, right? But if we all paid for trash pickup, and we didn't pay for organics, and we didn't pay for recyclables, but we paid for stuff going to landfills, the world would change, right? And if we actually had a market that actually reflected the true costs of hauling the stuff to Alabama or New Jersey, or the environmental costs of it, for example, I mean, that's the radical change you need to do. At the Trust for Governance Island, we're a tiny island, so we could just say, don't bring bad stuff to Governance Island, and we could, enforce that in a deeper way. Or we could incentivize stuff. As you pointed out, stuff that comes to the island, it should stay. It's better for it just not to leave. Therefore, if it's compostable, great, it can go in our composting bin. Or even some of our buildings, as some of you may know, when they were demolished, they became the foundations for hills in the park. So 35% of the hills are actually construction debris that didn't need to be hauled off. So we actually have a lot of kind of negative incentives to take things off island, but we're a very unique environment in that regard. But if we imagine that in Manhattan, for example, what is the true cost of hauling stuff off of the island? And if you charged, garbage trucks a different price than you did charge, vehicles or buses or bicycles or something like that. I mean, that's the policy, question that, not Governance Island and not even the city at this point can really kind of struggle with. It's like, can we ever get to the point when the market really forces us, or policy really inspires us to really cost our waste in a much more direct and appropriate way?
Yeah. Ka, do you want to respond to that?
So I guess I'll just say I think it's always challenging because there are different interests and different policy goals that one is balancing, right? So in addition to meeting our sustainability and decarbonization goals, we also want to continue to make the city an attractive place for small businesses. And so this is often the different sides of the equation that must be balanced when it comes to saying, well, we're going to start charging you more for this. We're going to enact additional policies that then need to be enforced vis-a-vis these businesses that could potentially drive them or make some of the cost of doing business in New York City uneconomic. I know it's kind of, it seems like maybe it's a leap to say, well, just requiring them to move off of certain type of plastics could upend the economics of a small business, but that also is the case in some cases, right? And so that's why I think there's a careful need to balance, especially kind of phasing in these policies and making sure that they're ultimately equitable in how companies are able to, the options that companies have to kind of manage and deal with the different policies. So I think LL 146 is an interesting example of that. That's a phase-in policy that requires different food businesses to divert their organics that I think, we're still kind of learning the lessons from. So I think I'll just kind of keep it at that. I do want to go back to the commercial hauling space, because I think there's some real opportunities there. As you know, or as you may know, a year ago or so, the mayor and the BIC announced a new plan to, right now, essentially any commercial facility contracts with a hauler and they get their garbage hauled away. And the issue is that essentially leads to a lot of excessive truck traffic across the city. It's grossly inefficient. You have people driving a lot of excess miles just because of where their hauling clients are relative to where transfer stations they prefer to go, or based upon transfer stations they have pre-existing business or other contractual relationships with. So what's going to happen, I think it's slated to come out in 2020, is an RFP that rather than is to change the commercial hauling system so that it's a zone system, and then companies would bid in to essentially service specific zones. So that is an improvement in itself in terms of the traffic and the kind of efficiency, but it also gives us some opportunities to use that RFP to potentially better create more and understand, first of all, what is in the commercial waste, but also kind of having a sense of, well, potentially homogenizing some of those waste streams, right? So depending on certain parts of the city where you are, you're going to have a high concentration of certain types of waste. So I know there was some thoughts on, for example, along the west side where there's the kind of a density of hotels. There's a lot of food waste generated there. So that would clearly be a zone where you know as a hauler and as a city that you would be getting a lot of food waste there. And you'd also probably know what transfer station it's going to because they're going to be contracted with a transfer station. So all of a sudden it's going to give us much more visibility into what types of waste is going to be going where, and then how can we continue to aggregate that waste and make it more useful. So I think that's definitely a platform that we're looking at to see how that can align with some of our other goals beyond just the commercial zoning.
Well, it's interesting when you think about just that inversion that you're talking about, that the market's so good at inputs, knowing when the beer truck is coming and knowing when the produce truck is coming, but we don't actually focus on the output side, which is that when you're taking the stuff off of a place or out of a commercial enterprise, like where it's going ultimately. But it's talk about like entrepreneurial, opportunities. It's like how you begin to capture that in some, really deep way. I mean, what we've talked about at Governor's Island is even something, it seems so mundane, but creating a cooperative of, compostable serviceware. So we can be pro-business, but also, pro, the environment at the same time. We say like, look, we'll just create a way for you to buy this stuff together at a discounted rate, and maybe government does it. I mean, in our case, we can do that, and we kind of buy this in bulk, and then you don't have to find out where you get the compostable straw or the compostable serviceware.
And if I may add, Ka, I'm glad you really talked about the commercial zoning because that's going to kind of catalyze this model around micro-hauling. And so you asked me earlier, Danielle, about what's a business that, I think is a good model or something that could be innovative in dealing with food waste in particular. It's called Common Ground Compost. So they're, provide certain areas, I think in Brooklyn, where they do micro-hauling, and I think the commercial zoning initiative is only going to catalyze even more operators in that space.
Yeah, we're really excited about the commercial hauling.
Yeah, we are too. We are too.
And to your point around, we do spend so much time on these inputs, and one of the big challenges in the areas that we wish we could see more innovation is around technologies that could read and understand the output side, where the waste is coming from, where it's going, how clean it is. One of our portfolio companies is a company called AMP Robotics, and it's an artificial intelligent vision system plus a robot. And so on a MRF line where the plastics are all being recycled, it's a material recovery facility. It can actually see that that's a Coke bottle, and that's a Dasani bottle, and that's a yogurt container, and I'm only going to pick out the water bottles with my robotic arm. And that's really exciting for us on the plastic side. We wish there was something else that could do it on the organic side to reduce contamination, that there was something that could read everything that's being dumped into the haulers' trucks to say, oh, this is actually a really contaminated stream from the hotel on the west side. We can then go back to them and educate them on what should actually be in their bins and where everything should go, or charge them for contamination. And those are the kinds of innovations that we're looking for in this space, and that I think we will start to see more and more of. So I want to transition a little bit as we kind of move the panel forward. This is Clean Energy Connections, and we talked. Kai, you talked a little bit about how the energy sector related to natural gas is integrated into the waste stream and what we're thinking about for organics. I wanted to give a chance to the other panelists also, Michael and Taniya, if you wanted to comment on that, if there were other ways in which you're integrating energy and circular economy principles.
Well, we certainly have, aspirations to be not just zero waste or as much zero waste as possible, but to be zero carbon or carbon neutral as quickly as possible. And again, as a small, tiny island, we today we use 4 megawatts of electricity today, and we could tomorrow, if we wanted to, through fuel cell technology, we could be off the grid, literally off the grid tomorrow if we really wanted to. But we have aspirations as we move towards redevelopment efforts to actually be completely off the grid if we can. I mean, it's just good business, because if there was anything I learned in my previous life at Hudson Yards, that development will be not quite off-grid, but will have a degree of energy independence. And if I was going to put my VC money anywhere, maybe you won't do this, but I would say, getting people off the grid, and even at a micro level, I think, people's apart. We've all lived through Sandy, we've lived through blackouts here in New York. I've been here for a while. That this idea of having some degree of independence from the grid is extremely important, both from a business continuity standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint. And those of us that have been through it have a hyper awareness of it. And I would argue, if not for Hurricane Sandy, you wouldn't have a $200 million cogeneration plant powering Hudson Yards, which they didn't have to build because Con Ed has to give them power. So this idea that you're using your discretion and using your money to pay for something which is perceived as a default right. We take lights for granted as if we have the right for light. Rhymes. But in fact, when the grid goes down, we want to be independent. So I think that idea of energy independence is something that I would certainly go along on.
We're not energy independent yet. What we've been really stewarding is the fact that every ounce of the food waste coming in is completely utilized. So what we've seen in the market in some of these food waste to product manufacturers, where they'll take, let's say, just the liquid form once their microbes have processed the food waste, and they'll create a liquid fertilizer out of that, or they create some type of soil amendment from it, but there's still a lot of fibers as residual from their own process, and then they have to figure out what to do with that. Similarly is experienced with anaerobic digesters. They're able to create gas. They're able to create a low-value liquid fertilizer, but there's a ton more of this low-value liquid fertilizer that they ultimately have to find a market for, and that's a challenge in itself. Whereas what we, I think, excel at is every part of the food is going into either making this granulated product, or we have liquid products that we make as well for completely different applications. In the future, to become energy dependent, even though our process is pretty low tech and not that energy demanding, is to incorporate solar, but that's not this year type initiative. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the future. And Michael, you brought up that really nice point of, if we're thinking about circular economy and how everything is connected together, we're looking at waste streams, we're looking at energy streams, we're looking at resiliency of the city as a whole, right? So this integrates with transportation initiatives, reducing the congestion on the streets. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And how do we respond to challenges? How do we not only dispose of our food waste, but get food into the city more rapidly? And part of that is, if we are doing like hydroponic growing within the city limits, then even if there is a problem, Sandy hits again, if the greenhouse is still standing and there's a food waste that's generating the power for that greenhouse, then we can all still, or at least somebody in the city can still eat. So I wonder if there are other forms of resiliency that you guys think of related to waste streams, not just food, but plastics and other parts of the economy.
Well, we certainly have aspirations with, it's hard to do this with historic buildings, but with new buildings. So we're planning, 4.5 million square feet of new development on the southern part of Governor's Island. And we very much look at sustainability as, the 3 legs of the stool, social sustainability, financial sustainability, and environmental sustainability. But how we actually have a financial sustainability model at Governor's Island to actually get off the public dole. So where our goal is actually not to take taxpayer dollars in the future. You're welcome. In order so that we can be independent. But I actually have aspirations, and we do at the Trust, for thinking about every surface of a building being productive. And that could mean PVs integrated into a facade system, and of course that technology is improving. Saying every roof will be a farm, and maybe it'll be a hydroponic farm. But we have a 1-acre urban garden on Governor's Island right now. Is a teaching garden for school children to come and learn about urban agriculture. But now imagine ratcheting that up, so it's really intensive. So we would like actually Governor's Island to be kind of a prototype for good urban planning and really sustainability at a very deep level that thinks about energy, that thinks about waste, that thinks about actually food production in a smart way, because we have, again, the indulgence of being this tiny place, but I think that we could do things right that could give us lessons for the larger city.
Yeah.
And I guess I would just say that, it's given the magnitude of the challenges we face, especially around sustainability and decarbonization, it's really, in some ways, all hands and all spaces on deck. So one of the biggest challenges we face in the city is that there's just not enough space to site, let's say, large-scale renewables or solar PV or even stormwater management systems. So to the extent that we can maximize the use of our roof space to deploy as much PV as possible and to think about different roof applications. So there's a lot of interesting kind of co-benefits around, for example, doing a green roof, for example, not only does it help with stormwater management, but it also can help reduce the overall heat of a building so that you use less air conditioning, which then saves the stress on the grid. And it also has a lot of public health benefits because, we talk about Sandy a lot, and that was clearly a policy focusing event for the city. But, 51 people died from Sandy. I should know this. But, hundreds of people die every year from heat risk, heat exposure in the city. And those are usually the most vulnerable of our citizens who don't have access to air conditioning, are, living in, places that are poorly ventilated. So I just kind of reiterate that when we think about climate change, it's not only about coastal storms, but it's also about heat and stormwater and urban flooding and all those other issues too. And I think just to maybe tie this all together in a nice way, so the city is currently looking at building out a microgrid to provide resiliency for the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center. While resiliency is the basis for the funding that we receive for the federal government for that, the project itself is also financial. It makes financial sense because it's also about making the cooling and heating systems of that food distribution center much, much more efficient through kind of centralized running cold and hot water loops versus individual cooling units. That is kind of the way the markets are currently structured. So in a future phase, because of all the food waste that is generated at Hunts Point, and also because of the location of a nearby DEP wastewater treatment plant, we're also looking at, is there a future phase where not only can this microgrid be super efficient, provide carbon savings, and provide resiliency to the food distribution center, which provides, I think, 25% of the food that's consumed and distributed within the city, although different percentages depending if you're talking about produce, fish, or meat. But also that in a future phase, maybe that microgrid could be powered with renewable gas that's created from the food waste at the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center. So I think that's kind of where, when we start thinking 5-10 years out, that's kind of really the world that we want to envision. So
great. Yeah, and I want to add another layer on top of all of this. So we're talking all about circular economies, material flows, energy flows. One of the conversations that I was having earlier today was actually around the future of work. And one of the things that gets me really excited about the circular economy is if you think about what it means to collect waste streams or, organic streams or recycling streams and then do something with them nearby. You're talking about creating more local economies. And so we talk about kind of social resiliency. There's a lot to be said for keeping jobs locally around these industries that can't actually be outsourced. They have to stay in the city and they have to stay close to where the waste is being produced. And so I wonder if you guys want to talk a little bit about that. Maybe Taniya, if you want to talk about, what does it mean to be building a business and employing people, and what does that look like for you, and then the rest of the panel as well.
Sure. We try to kind of start off with security of the food waste supply. And I hate to make it so food waste based. I know we're supposed to be talking about energy, but it's all related, right? So, if looking at from the point of the farm downstream all the way down to the point of consumption, where can we provide the most value, ideally to the farm first? And then where can we, upcycle for them a product that provides more of a return for them at the farm? And then throughout the entire supply chain, how can we turn into a value-added product that can be reused in some shape or form? So our resiliency comes around, it involves that supply chain. In terms of workforce development, I think I think for, and I'll just kind of be specific to renewable. So there's an opportunity for us to take renewable and co-locate it, for example, along composting facilities, right? There's definitely a lot of synergies for us to collaborate with existing anaerobic digesters, because there are opportunities to make a combined byproduct that is of higher value than what is done by itself. So workforce development to us means that it's creating collaborations that allows us to develop new products that ideally serve as, whether it's bio-based materials or serving as a source of energy, or serving as a more efficient way to treat the waste. And for example, another company called Biofiltro, based in California, I think they have 157 plants worldwide, but they use microbes and worms to treat wastewater waste volumes. So I know that's not being too specific, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for new roles consulting on waste streams, whether it's at specific supply chains of brands, let's say for General Mills, or within municipalities, and really starting off at the source of the food, which is at our farms, and working our way down.
Yeah, I think for us, since we're a park, basically, right now, environmental education is a big part of the story for us. And I think that what Earth Matter does really well is that we don't quite have a robot. We literally have a person standing there who says, don't put that there, put that there. And it's rough, but creates jobs. Actually, they're volunteers. So doesn't create jobs yet. But so the robot wouldn't really displace anyone. But it is about creating a sensitivity. And, I assume this audience, since you're all here and spending a couple hours thinking about this and hearing about it, you're sensitive to it. But, there's 8.6 million people out there, and they're not all thinking the way we're thinking. So I think the question is how you do kind of like radical environmental education. So one of my favorite things that happened in the past year when we went to kind of all compostable service was that at a little pop-up, whether it's a burger place or a beer garden, there's no trash can. There's only a recycle bin and an organics bin. And it confuses everyone to no end because, like, where do I put the fork? Or where do I put my beer cup? It's like, no, that's compostable. But you have to actually show people, because we don't live in that world now. People, I'm 47. I grew up just everything went in a bag and it somehow disappeared. Children probably think differently than that, but we do have to think about the educational component to it and the kind of how we communicate the great technologies that exist that some people may know about, but not everybody does. But really, how you get the message out, I think, is one of the most important things that I learned, and that you do it through something radical, like just taking away the trash can and forcing them to make a decision on where it goes.
I would just say that, when we think about different policy objectives and initiatives, understanding the workforce development implications and how we can tie those two pieces together is always a consideration. And I think we're really excited about some of the sustainability initiatives that are under development, because we do feel that to help to get the city to reach its carbon reduction goals, there's going to be a need for a whole different type of workforce, especially around, energy auditing, building engineers, building retrofits, energy efficiency upgrades, distributed generation, storage. So there's a range of, I think, different types of roles and opportunities. And we really want to make sure that there's also then a pipeline to make sure that people have access to the appropriate training opportunities to access those new jobs. So it has to be kind of an integrated approach. And so that's something that we do think about a lot, and I think is a real big opportunity. And I think some of that echoes what others have been saying nationally as well.
I want to add one other thing. So I think a lot more cities are catching on. We've seen this in Boston. We're seeing this in New York, where the data before making these very broad sustainability goals and zero waste goals, we need to have more data to really evaluate the infrastructure to handle the growing waste volumes and to really track, how much carbon emissions is being caused by hauling, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's definitely a workforce being around just data management, data curation, and generation before the policy, or should lead before the policy is actually created.
Great. Yeah, thank you guys for that. And this is a quick reminder to everyone in the audience, you all had note cards, and so if you have a question that you would like to ask the panelists, please pass those note cards to the side, and somebody will be by to collect them. But we'll start asking some of those questions from the audience. The first question up is that since pollution is a global issue and global solutions are needed, are there any plans or methods to make the circular economy model operate worldwide and have multiple countries participate in it? I know you guys are working at different scales. I can take this question on, but if you guys are you collaborating with other cities? Are you collaborating with other companies and other locations?
I collaborate with other islands.
Other islands?
That's a joke. No, I mean I think as a planner, I mean it is like it's what gives me faith in this conversation is the fact that it's not just regulation. 'Cause we can talk about regulation all we want, right? But regulation can vary. You know, like one side of the Hudson River does one thing with their waterfront, the other side of the Hudson River does something completely different. And guess what? It's the same river, and yet the regulatory regimes are differently. But what inspires me is the market-based approach. You know, because I not that I'm a huge market believer, but sometimes the market will kind of supersede the regulatory regime. You know, regulation can only do so much, but if you actually create a smart, dynamic, entrepreneurial, and innovative enterprise, that will allow you to go from Massachusetts to New York to New Jersey to Connecticut to potentially around the world. So if the market is like sustainable enough, I think that can supersede the kind of balkanization that we have from a regulatory because all due respect to Paris, like the world can try to do as much as it can collaboratively, but you're always going to have some players outside of it.
Yeah, and so what's interesting about closed loop partners and what we do is collaborate more with other private sector participants, but multinational private sector participants. And so to your point around market-based solutions, Closed Loop Fund gets its capital to invest in recycling infrastructure in the U.S. from Coke, Pepsi, Nestle, Danone, Amazon, Unilever, big multinational companies, Walmart. There are more that I haven't listed. So I think what's interesting about this, the idea of creating global solutions is saying, okay, global governments might not be working together as quickly as we would want them to. There are some that are doing great. The Danish Clean Tech Hub is doing a lot of really good work for us right now. But it's really hard to coordinate global political efforts. Companies can move much faster on a lot of these issues, and you're seeing this across the CPG product space where a lot of our investors come from. We're seeing it across the textile and apparel space as well. H&M, CNA, PVH. These are all big multinational brands that are putting not just time and marketing dollars behind it, but really they're investing in solutions. They're actively investing in early stage companies, in developing plants that are creating the circular economy in Europe and starting to be in the US as well. And so I think we're seeing the global effort happen. I mean, I'm biased. My view is in the private markets. I'm seeing it happen a lot in the private market space and be supported by more progressive governments across the world.
And I would support that. I mean, I think there's more conversations at least being had. The Embassy of Denmark, a lot of embassies are actually inviting people like innovators, policymakers, advocates, just to have ideas being shared and discussions around what is effective as best practices. And then also the SDGs are certainly catalyzing a lot more conversations as well.
I would say, yeah, I mean, we definitely engage with other cities, we engage with other countries and try to kind of draw lessons learned. I think in terms of especially around the kind of waste to energy and the waste space, I do feel like there's a fair amount of lessons that we've been learning from Europe. A lot of the anaerobic digestion technologies are more mature in Europe or Japan, and so some of the merchant facilities we're seeing, they're being invested in and leveraging technology that was developed elsewhere. I would also say, that I think culturally and from a behavior perspective, I think there's a little bit of difference between us and some of the European countries and how we deal with waste. I think another really interesting opportunity that is being implemented in Canada and Europe is the notion of using waste heat, in particular from wastewater treatment processes and pipes, to then leverage that waste heat into a thermal district heating network. That's something that Vancouver has done pretty well, especially recently with some of the new development that they had come in because of the Olympics in the past decade. And so I think the challenge, to your point on the regulatory side, is how do you take these technologies and models that were developed under different kinds of regulatory regimes and different kinds of commodity market structures and try to translate that to the New York City context? I would also say, of course, from a kind of efficiency and effectiveness perspective, working at a greater scale than the city, obviously makes sense, right? Carbon is a global problem. Air pollution is a regional and a global problem. And so the larger the market is and the larger the shared goal, the greater the competitiveness and the greater ability to reduce costs across technologies or across resources. So I think we think from a carbon perspective, RGGI has been a great vehicle on the electric side. We'd be interested in seeing how that could be expanded to cover other sectors, in addition to continuing to do all that we can at a city level. I think the unique role that cities play is that while we have a small jurisdiction, we have an outsized impact because of all the things that we consume and the reach of our supply chains and the kind of potential power of our purchasing power. And so even things that we do here can have impacts around the country and around the world because of how we handle and treat our own supply chains. And I think finally, there is still an important role for just showing that it can be done, right? And so I think people do look to New York City as kind of a role model in terms of how can you develop and implement effective policies to tackle different sustainability and environmental issues. And so to show that we can do it here, I do think helps kind of other cities and jurisdictions say, yeah, well then, we can do it too. And so I think we take that role pretty seriously as well.
Yeah. So the next question is kind of getting more granular, going from the global back down to New York City. Having compostable services and products is a huge step, but NYC is severely lacking in spaces and bins. So what's going on?
So I guess I'm not exactly sure what you mean by spaces. And I think, so we have the residential organics program that currently serves about 3.5 million. I think we're going to put a pause on expanding it for now, like I said, until we kind of double down our efforts within these neighborhoods to improve the contamination rates and so forth. There's also, of course, public composting bins that happen across the city. It's definitely an area of ongoing focus for us. And as many issues, as it sounds similar to other issues across the city where we do struggle with finding and optimizing what we do with the space we have. So,
yeah.
Others.
Right. If you're looking for it, you might go to your local farmer's market.
Mm-hmm. Precisely. And I learned something while prepping for this event. I learned that in buildings larger than 10 units, there should be residential e-waste collections at the buildings. So if your building doesn't have one, maybe inquire about that. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do that for my building.
So what do you see as the most critical New York City need / opportunities for small companies and tech startups? And I think maybe this would be like a wish list of, what would the thing be that you would most want to see happen to help grow your business or to help facilitate some of the circular economy solutions that you're hoping to see?
Well, I think there's two. One I mentioned already. Just if you're going to talk wish list, I think it's that I'll say it again. If you properly, if we were more sensitive to the real cost of our waste, I think that would probably, if it just wave a wand and all of a sudden we know what it actually costs to process this stuff, I think it would dramatically change people's perceptions. Just as an administrator of a place, as I said, we know everything that comes on and everything comes off. So we are very sensitive to it. We have these big stones that were part of the seawall from 1902, and they became part of a walkway up a hill because it was a lot easier to not take them off the island. And we actually thought of something really creative to do with it. So I think making people as sensitive on a personal level as we are from administrative level is important. I'm sure someone here would know more about this than me, but a couple of years ago there was a young woman who walked around for a month with every bit of trash that she generated, and she literally walked around and she just put little and so she was a living metaphor for how much even a smart, urbane young woman in New York, how much trash she actually generated. So thinking about these things that happen at a metaphorical level, but also at a policy level, I think would be kind of magical in terms of transformation of our sensitivity to the true cost of waste.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the challenges in actually evaluating the true cost of waste is this data problem, right? Mm-hmm. That we're really good at collecting data, as Ka was mentioning, really good at collecting data on energy pipelines and things that have already high value today, but these are currently priced at, waste is a low value item today. And so how do you create a sensor or a data collection methodology that matches that low price point that's necessary?
Mm-hmm.
I kind of expand, Ka, you were looking for feedback on the last question. I think the most discernible kind of product that would be immensely helpful to anyone that's trying to divert food waste in the most energy efficient way is if there was an organic waste resource locator specific to all 5 boroughs that gave an estimate of, let's say, weekly, daily, monthly waste generation volumes, right? Pounds or tons. And then also, to your point, would also kind of show what is the space availability, whether it's in back of house, actually inside the business, or outside, that's available for bins or carts or a modular food waste processing technology that can be done on site. That platform doesn't exist. If someone wants to run with that today, I'll give you my business card, but I think that's a great product.
That's interesting. I haven't looked into it. It wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't, or it sounds like there is not a compost or organic waste collecting map of some kind. I'll take that back. That's Oh, okay. Okay. Is it do you think it's pretty comprehensive? Okay.
It's very good, actually. It, of course, doesn't include all locations for various composts, but for food scrap drop-off sites specific.
I appreciate that, but what I'm speaking of is the commercial, the industrial, even residential, about just private sector though, how much food waste is being generated. And then for businesses like mine or people that want to get into the business of consulting, they actually know how they can best divert it based on what's being generated.
Yeah, and I am hoping that the commercial zoning shift will definitely help improve our own understanding of who is creating what type of waste. So it's the commercial side is
Great. And then the next question is, what materials or processors currently don't have a circular alternative? Where maybe let's step outside of organics, because we've been talking about that for a long time. Where can R&D be focused on developing solutions that will have quite a large impact? My immediate answer to that question is actually in the electronic space. Yeah, there's a lot of e-waste being generated as everyone has phones and solar panels start to come off roofs, and there's just a lot of electronic equipment that's going into landfill and obviously causing these problems that we talked about earlier, and there's not really a good way to break it down today. Right now, the current process for taking electronic waste is grinding it up in massive shredders, which is not very efficient, trying to separate out the plastics versus the circuit boards that have all the valuable materials on them, and then trying to kind of piece out through a mechanical process a lot of the gold or the cobalt, if you're whatever it is that you're trying to extract value from, and I'm lumping batteries and electronics into the same bucket, by the way. There are a handful of companies that are trying to use chemical recycling to break down batteries and electronics, so that you could dump everything into one vat and then into another vat and just have all of the valuable materials come out in solution. And that's really interesting, but it's very early stage. And so I would say that there's probably a lot of room for innovation in that space. One challenge is that the reuse market for electronics is kind of hard. There was a refurbisher like of Apple phones that got in trouble with Apple recently, because Apple, like the large companies don't want you to refurbish their old phones because it takes away from their market. And so I would say that's one space that could use a lot of innovation.
Yeah, it's not really my world, but it seems to make sense. I mean, it just does the counter to organics, but from the most simplex to the most complex, that the more complex things are, the harder they are to recycle.
Right.
And I would just echo that. I think that is definitely going to be a challenge as we continue to see the proliferation of solar panels and storage systems.
Right.
So that's definitely something we're thinking about, is what is the true life cycle kind of cost, and how do we kind of manage that?
Right.
I will say, my earbuds would break all the time. So I would throw them out, obviously. So I finally bought expensive earbuds, and then they hang out a lot longer. So maybe it's just like this move towards like quality instead of this disposable culture of like electronics are really effing cheap, right? So we buy them. It's like, all right, it's disposable. I'll buy another one. So it is, if you could inspire, if we get a second wish in the magic wand, it's just the, moving to quality, so a little like your European cultural mentality is like, have fewer better things instead of a lot of crap.
I'm on board with that. You could say that in the textile industry too.
Yeah. So, Kat, this one is more for you, I think. How do you enforce policies?
I think that's depends on the policy, I guess. But for certain policies, there's actually enforcement personnel embedded within agencies that take on that role. So I don't know, just an easy example is, well, how do you enforce health code in the city, right? DOH sends out health inspectors to all restaurants on a twice-a-year basis to do the inspections. But some policies are definitely harder to enforce than others, and you need to make sure that there's funds and budget going towards that enforcement, right? So I think you did kind of hone in on a thing where you can pass as many policies as you want, but figuring out how is the enforcement mechanism happening, and who's doing it, and are those people that are doing it funded appropriately, are always good things to kind of dig deeper into in the context of that policy. And there are certain situations where maybe enforcement isn't happening, and that's another area where you can kind of go into and say, well, why do you think that's the case? So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
And this will, depending on how long this takes, this might be our last question, but kind of going back to the workforce issues and employment opportunities, more often than not, the people who are doing the work in the circular economy for a city like New York can't necessarily afford to live close to the city center or even in the city itself. And so how are we looking to address these income issues? It's a hard question.
So I think, the mayor in his 2 terms has really emphasized the notion of equity as a guiding principle behind all of his policies. And I think the affordable housing expansion that we've seen in the past 6 years, as well as initiatives like universal free pre-K, kind of speak to that. I would say on the energy side, one thing that our office is taking a close, hard look at is how much do utility bills currently burden low-income households as we continue to try to meet different energy policy goals and sustainability objectives. There are, you see that reflected in different surcharges that might appear on your electric bill that go toward kind of state funds to kind of incentivize renewables and clean energy. We have already some of the highest utility electric rates in the country, I think second to Hawaii, because of how old our infrastructure is and the cost needed to maintain a reliable system. And so I think that's looking at that and making sure that not only are there programs in place that help to offset those costs, but also kind of indirect opportunities to offset those costs. So how do we focus energy efficiency efforts on LMI buildings without that leading to a rent increase because it's a major capital improvement? So that's something we grapple with a lot. How can we make sure that community solar really takes off in the city so that solar panels aren't only available to people that own their own brownstone, and that the rest of the 45% of people in New York City that live near or below poverty can have some access to both renewable energy, but also the bill credits that come with it. So I think this is something that we really think hard about, and we think about the unintended consequences of some of the policies that we're trying to enact, and trying our best to kind of understand what those are, those interactive effects, and to extent proactively mitigate where possible.
I mean, it's a much larger, I mean, that's another panel, or that's a dissertation. But I mean, the question is, how do we actually help people live closer to where they work? And if we're going to create all these new jobs, how do they get to live in the city? I mean, as an urban planner, it's just a question of density. It's just like, if we're a city of 8.6 million people, why aren't we a city of 20 million people? But people freak out if a tall building gets built in their neighborhood, and yet you can't have it both ways. Either we're going to build more supply and have more opportunities for people to live, including kind of regulatory changes with the multiple dwelling law and allowing micro units and allowing live work in a really dramatic way. We have these, our zoning laws are written that promotes balkanization of land use. You shop here, your factory is there, your office building is there, your house is there. I mean, we're living with, antiquated zoning laws. So until we really think holistically about rethinking our regulations to reflect the reality of living and working in the same place, we're not going to get there, because you have, inherent NIMBYism in neighborhoods that don't want density, certainly don't want affordable housing, certainly don't want homeless housing, and yet, we want prices to go down, or we want affordability. So it's really a much larger question of like, probably the best thing to do for an environment is to live in a big, dense city, and not to live out, even in the country. Even with an electric car, it's still probably better in terms of your carbon footprint on the world to live in a dense place where you walk to work or take the subway or take a bus. So it's a much larger question of, I think, density, and really tackling it in a way which is equitable and embraces policy changes.
Yeah, I'm out. Taniya and I were having a great conversation earlier about like how she was like educating people about like how to manage their budgets properly and do financial inclusion in really interesting ways. And so, I mean, I think that we talk about circular economy and creating these jobs. I think one of the things that we look to do is create well-paying jobs. Sanitation workers in New York City are actually paid quite well, and so I think when we talk about these issues, it's not just collection, sortation, and the kind of processing of these waste streams. These are jobs that require the skills of driving a truck, of being aware of like the engineering that's required and the biology that's required to run an anaerobic digestion plant. And so I think that there's an element of that like there's an upskilling or a reskilling of labor that we can talk about related to the circular economy, both within jobs that people already have and towards new jobs where we see this economy shifting to, in order to create that kind of inclusive economy that we want, I think. So with that, I think that's it. That's all we had for today. So thank you all for coming and. And I believe we have networking for the next half hour or so. There are some refreshments in the back that you guys can go grab, and we'll be up here for a little bit also.